Hey, so let's talk about where organisms live in the ecosystem of the ocean. We've talked in the past about benthic organisms that live along the bottom. Another word you might have heard is nekton. That means things that swim in the water column. But today we're going to focus on plankton. These are plants and animals and similar species that can't swim but drift in the water, and they really can't control their movement. So they are much more susceptible to being moved around by things like waves that might push them into shore or take them away from shore, the tides that would do similar things, and then the giant oceanic currents that would carry them across or within ocean basins. So when we talk about plankton, we tend to group them in three ways. We might group them by size, so you'll see what constitutes small, big, and gigantic when it comes to plankton. We'll talk about how they use this habitat, whether they're there for the long term or only temporarily, and then what the different taxonomic or species type groups there are. So let's start with size. Tiny picoplankton are maybe up to 2 whole microns, micrometers in size. So these are bacteria. Bacteria in the plankton are really important because they're going to be breaking down dead material. So these are the decomposers. They may also do photosynthesis. The next bigger size is up to 20 whole micrometers, and these are called nanoplankton. They're protozoan, so single-celled, very small. Still on the mostly single-celled side of things are microplankton. So we're going to learn about diatoms because they're very, very important to the marine ecosystem. We'll also see that the eggs of certain fish and other living organisms, animals, fit into this category, and some larvae, so the babies of certain species. Macro, so what we might think of as large, is still like maybe 2 centimeters in size. So 2,000 microns is about two centimeters. We're talking again fish, larvae, and eggs and things like that. On the gigantic side of plankton, we have things that are as gigantic as this ctenophore, comb jelly, and even the mola mola, which is a fish that really can't swim. And so it's technically considered plankton, and those can get up to like 6 to 8 feet long. So there's really a huge range in size from bacteria all the way up to these mega plankton. So if we were to look at categories based on how they use the space in terms of their lifespan, we have organisms called holoplankton, meaning these are species that live their entire life in the water and can never really swim against current and can never really join the benthos. So jellyfish, and this is a scanning electron micrograph, so really zoomed in of a diatom. And this is what copepods really look like as seen under the microscope. This is a sketch, but that's their actual appearance for those of you who think SpongeBob is accurate, which it's not. All right. On the other side of things, there are species that only live part of their lifespan in the plankton. So things like crabs and snails and fish are going to, as adults, live on the bottom, benthic organisms, or be able to swim against the current as nekton. But when they're juveniles, they're pushed around by the currents. They really can't do anything about that. So finally, we're going to look at the different groups of types of species. The two big groupings are phytoplankton. These are the plant-like plankton that do photosynthesis, and we'll get into a couple of these different types here. And the zooplankton. ZOO is the prefix that means animal. So all the animal kingdom plankton. So let's start with some of those phytoplankton. Thing to know about phytoplankton, remember they have to do photosynthesis, so they have to be in the euphotic zone, and they need nutrients. So if we have a place where there is an upwelling or seasonal currents bring nutrients, or maybe rain that causes nutrients to come off the shore, we are going to get something called a phytoplankton bloom. That means lots and lots of these tiny phytoplankton are growing and reproducing so that normally blue water would become green with their abundance. And so we can see satellite images. So this is off the coast of Alaska. This is as temperatures warm up and sunlight becomes available, we get phytoplankton blooms in this region. So that would be in the summertime. We can also have phytoplankton blooms of phytoplankton that are not green, and so this is a red tide that is caused by certain types of phytoplankton becoming very common due to a rain event pushing out lots of nutrients offshore, and that's not something you want to get caught out in, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So there are a lot of different groups. This is not a fully biological oceanography course, so you're not going to have to know all about these different ones down here. But two big groups you should know about are diatoms and dinoflagellates, because they're very, very abundant and very important. Diatoms are sometimes referred to as being a pillbox shape because they have a hard shell made of silica, and they have a top half and a bottom half that fit together kind of like a little tin box or something like that. And so they reproduce by that popping apart, and each half becomes the half of a new one. They can live individually on their own, and you can get lots of different shapes and sizes, or this, you can see this has some spines that are growing, and that helps them make long chains. So we would call that being colonial, meaning part of a colony. The pigments that they use for photosynthesis are a golden brown color, and so diatoms are what cause a lot of the rocks in the area to look kind of like they've got a brown slime on them. You might sometimes see algae that has a sort of a fluffy brownish tinge to it. That's probably because they're covered in diatoms. They're very, very abundant in ecosystems like Sipican Harbor. Dinoflagellates are a different group. These ones have a flagellum, so hopefully you learned about that in biology. They can swim around a tiny bit. Their shell is made out of carbohydrates and other types of material that makes it not quite as hard, but a little bit more flexible. Again, these are mostly golden brown in color, but sometimes they can make a more orangey or red color. So dinoflagellates, certain species are the ones that produce harmful toxins and make something like red tide, which is one example of a harmful algal bloom, HAB. These dinoflagellates will produce toxins that are irritating for our skin, and if we were to eat shellfish that ate those diatoms by filtering them out of the water, we would get very sick, and that's what causes certain shell fisheries to close for a while until they process the toxins out of them. A nicer example of a dinoflagellate are the groups that are bioluminescent. And so if you've ever gone to Puerto Rico or Mexico or certain parts of California, there are these free swimming ones, this totally different species here. And as they get jostled around the water, they glow. So this blue light is actually from dinoflagellates giving off a little bit of bioluminescence. Other dinoflagellates live as symbiotic organisms inside of squid and other deep sea creatures. And finally, there's a group of dinoflagellates that you can see here. Yeah. All of these little dots in here are dinoflagellates that are called zooxanthellae, or zooks for short. They produce the oxygen and sugars that corals and giant clams use. And so they're really important in marine ecosystems as being part of the food chain and being part of those sort of structural organisms. But it's a symbiosis, so you have one species living inside of another. So when it comes to the zooplankton, I'm going to talk about the ones that live their whole lives there, and then briefly about some that only spend their larvae phase there. So here's a copepod. This is an actual light microscope photograph of one. They have these long antennae, and they are able to swim around, and some light sensing organs, so that's why sometimes you see them as having a big giant eye there. This is the most abundant type of zooplankton out there. Krill, which you might have heard of before, is part of a group called euphausids. They look like this. They're very similar to mysis shrimp, so if anybody keeps a fish tank and has to feed frozen mysis shrimp to their fish, this is kind of what you're doing. Very, very important for all those fish and whales and sharks that eat krill and other kinds of plankton. And then we have other things that don't have a hard shell. So cnidarians, which are like jellyfish, and man o' war, Portuguese man o' war, those have stinging cells. Related to them are ctenophores or comb jellies that don't have any stinging cells, and that's actually what a lot of people in Marion call moon jellies, but actually they're a ctenophore. They're not technically jellyfish. And then we even have some things like pteropods and worms and some really cool things that are out there. And then finally, we've got plankton, the larvae. So lots of different fish larvae, especially pelagic fishes, ones that live far away from shore. They release eggs into the water, and their larvae might have these little spiky things on them, trying to not be too appetizing. A lot of them are clear, so they won't be noticed. And then invertebrates that live on the ground often release their eggs and sperm into the water, or their fertilized eggs into the water, it depends on the species, and that helps carry these babies to a new place so they're not competing with their parents. But for example, this is a sea star, and this is probably a sea star, and that's a sea urchin. This is what a barnacle looks like when it's a larvae. Those are all its little legs. There are types of worms, segmented worms, that live in the planktonic phase. You can have, this is going to be a coral eventually. This is going to be a worm. These two are going to be snails over here. And you can see we've got things like jellyfish that look very much like their parents. All right, so lots of really interesting variety, both on the plant-like side of things and on the animal side of things.